Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Yoder, and I study comparative literature, history, and Latin, and I'm so excited to present my senior honors thesis in comparative literature today, titled Natural Loss, Henry David Thoreau's Poetic Reception of Virgilian Pastoral. And I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to Professor Lee and to Professor Yoder, both in BU's Department of Classical Studies, for their ongoing support throughout this project as my advisors. So to begin with, to introduce the project and my research framework, this project was carried out within the framework of attaining honors in the comparative literature major in the Department of World Languages and Literatures. So my final deliverable and the shape that this project takes is a long-form academic paper. And it falls within the field of classical reception studies, which is a subfield within the field of classical studies, so the study of ancient Greece and of ancient Rome. And classical reception studies explores how those civilizations impacted the generations and the civilizations that came after them. So through literary studies, philosophy, architecture, art history, it's very diverse and has garnered a lot of attention recently. The poetry that I look at in my thesis is pastoral literature, and to give a brief introduction to pastoral as a genre, it is literature that contends with the lives of shepherds as its primary protagonists. And the primary source texts with which I worked were Virgil's Eclogues, a collection of 10 poems by the Roman poet Virgil, and then selected poems by Henry David Thoreau, an American transcendentalist author. And there is a great need for research in this area because Thoreau was very well-versed in classical studies, but basically no existing scholarship explores his poetry through the lens of classical studies. To address my research questions and dive further into my methodology, my general research question that I pursued throughout this project was, why does Thoreau adapt themes from Virgil's Eclogues in his own poetry? And to explore these ideas, I used methods from comparative literature. So to give a bit of an idea of the timeline that I followed, I began by completing close readings of my primary sources, so annotating the poems, spending a lot of time reading them, taking extensive notes on them, basically searching for thematic similarities between my sources. I then surveyed existing scholarship about Virgil's Eclogues independently, Henry David Thoreau independently, and then also Thoreau's relationship to classical studies, which was really the area that needs further research and where a lot of the most exciting work, I think, is to be done. I then moved into writing, so I began by drafting some short, close readings of my primary sources and then forming a more cohesive outline of the final paper. And I also translated the sections of the Eclogues that I cite into English from Latin. To give a brief background on Virgil and Henry David Thoreau, so Publius Virgilius Maro, now known as Virgil, was a Roman poet during the Augustan or Golden Age of Roman literature. He lived from 70 to 21 BC and is best known for his work The Aeneid, the national epic of ancient Rome. Henry David Thoreau was an American transcendentalist author who lived just about 35 minutes away from here in Concord, Massachusetts, and is best known for his work Walden, an exploration of living a rustic life on Walden Pond that many Americans are familiar with because it's introduced in many high school curricula. And so to address the question of why compare the poetic works of these two authors and why I feel justified in my basis of comparison between these literary works, Thoreau was extremely well-versed in ancient literature. He entered his undergraduate years at Harvard College with advanced reading proficiency in both ancient Greek and Latin. And actually, after graduating from college, he spent 2 years independently translating Virgil's Eclogues from 1837 to 1839. So I argue in my thesis that Thoreau receives the themes of mourning, civic strife, and ecological destruction from Virgil's Eclogues to illustrate threats to his New England landscape, which he in turn understands as an inheritor of classical values. And in my paper, I conclude that Thoreau depicts nature as embattled and at risk rather than merely as an idealized placeholder for virtue. To give an example of my methodology and what some of these close readings look like, I've included a section from Virgil's Eclogue 5, which contends with the death of Daphnis, a pastoral shepherd and an archetypal figure of the Eclogues. And then I also include some stanzas from Thoreau's poem titled Lately, Alas, I Knew a Gentle Boy, which mourns the death of a young neighboring boy with whom Thoreau held a close relationship. So to read the Virgil, after the fates carried you away, Pallas herself abandoned the fields, and even Apollo himself. Often in the ruts to which we entrusted full-grown barley, unlucky darnel and barren straw grow, Instead of the gentle violet, instead of the purple narcissus, the thistle with its thorn and the spiky shrub grow. And then Thoreau writes, make haste and celebrate my tragedy, with fitting strain resound ye woods and fields. And a thematic similarity that I draw from these two sections of literature is a trope very common in pastoral literature known as pathetic fallacy. Pathetic coming from pathos, the intense emotion of grief that both of these authors are working with. And then fallacy because nature is personified as mourners in both of these poems, which is a fallacy because nature is not alive, it has no consciousness, it cannot mourn. And so in my paper, I explore how both of these authors use nature to hyperbolize and extend their grief for those lost into the poetic natural landscape that surrounds them. So to conclude by addressing why I think this research matters and why I find meaning in it, it adds nuance to Thoreau's legacy first and foremost. Thoreau was not a successful poet. He did not receive great acclaim for his poems during his lifetime, either at large through publications or really from his friends, but he really found great meaning in writing poetry and as an artist. So I hope to add remembrance to his legacy as someone who was a poet. And also because really, as I mentioned, no research exists between classical studies and analysis of his poetry that explores how he receives these classical themes in his poetry rather than his prose. And furthermore, I think that this research holds weight for climate change in our contemporary moment. I think that exploring how these two authors understand a very close, nuanced relationship between humanity and the natural environment has implications in the present as we constantly evaluate our relationship to the landscape around us. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to answering questions.
Okay, let me see hands, people.
Hi, thanks for this excellent presentation. I am curious about the idea that nature does not grieve, that kind of objective view of nature, and I'm wondering if that comes like where that supposition came to you, and if that is like from the culture of these writers, or if it emerged from a more like objective view, and how that exists in maybe poetry beyond.
Of course, I'm afraid that I phrased that poorly. So what I argue in my paper is that these authors are using nature to hyperbolize their grieving. So both of them in instances such as these explore how death interrupts natural life cycles. So what I meant by it doesn't grieve is that it doesn't literally grieve because it does not have human agency. So that was just part of the explanation of the literary device, but my apologies if that was unclear. Thank you.
Really nice, Emily. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on if you know of any events in Thoreau's lifetime that gave him this particular viewpoint. So industrialization comes to mind, and what things made him see the world different from his contemporaries.
Absolutely. I'd like to start with his relationship to grief and answering that question because he experienced two very devastating personal losses around the time that he composed these poems. And the first was of his younger brother, who died very tragically in his arms from tetanus a week after he cut himself shaving, and he and Thoreau were extremely close. And this was a major disruption in Thoreau's literary and artistic life. He stopped journaling for a year, and he has one poem titled Brother, Where Dost Thou Dwell that I explore at length, and that deals very personally with that loss. And he also suffered the loss of a neighboring boy with whom he was very close, who I believe was actually part of the Emerson family. But he does also write about the disruptions of the railroad and industrialization in Massachusetts. So I kind of see the disruptions from those two sides, one being extreme personal loss, and then the other being the advent of the railroad. And he also criticized his neighbors for their farming practices as being wasteful, and so that was another disruption. Thank you, though.
Hi, this was super interesting. I was interested in your translation process a little bit. I know, like, when you're translating anything, there's a ton of decisions you have to make, but especially with Poetic Latin. I was wondering, again, a little more about the process, what that was like, and any challenges you faced with that.
Absolutely. I think the most major, and this translation wasn't so much at the forefront of this project as the literary analysis, but one major challenge I faced is that the eclogues have just been translated so many different times, and I first encountered them within the framework of a BU course. So I translated them through that course and then read a few different translations when compiling this. And so I think in deciding how to finally articulate them in my work, it was difficult to not have almost subconsciously memorized existing translations. But I think that one of the most exciting parts of translating them, and you can see it in this section particularly clearly, is the specific plant species referenced, that just brought me back to Thoreau, who was such a naturalist. And I think it was exciting to see that Virgil had the same close knowledge of the plant life with which he was working. Thank you.
Got one last question, and then we'll take a quick break.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I just had a question about how do you think Thoreau, being a transcendentalist, affected his work in poetry specifically?
Definitely. One way in which I think that his identity as a transcendentalist impacted this personification of death and emotion into the landscape is that the transcendentalists understood that you could find the sublime in the everyday and in instances such as outings into nature rather than within, I don't know, as opposed to something like Catholicism where there are these ideas of epiphany and major divine moments of understanding in more exceptional circumstances. So I think that the fact that he was constantly looking for these examples of the sublime and the everyday made his relationship with the landscape more meaningful because it's a place where that could happen. Thank you.